All right, well, let's welcome Phil Oakley on, author of Little Hatchet. I guess, Phil, if you would just like to give a brief introduction about yourself so we can start this interview off.
Well, this is my ninth novel, and it is the only one that's still in print, and it's already the best-selling book I've ever written. So I'm pretty happy about that part of it. It's a family history in a way, but there's way too much history that I don't know. And by the time I got around to actually writing the book, there wasn't anybody else left around to ask. So that's when it became a novel instead of a biography. Originally, it's supposed to have been a biography of my grandfather, who was one of the most special people I've ever known, and I've lived a long time.
Okay, and so I take it from that. So for those that don't know, the main character of the novel is Walter. So I'm assuming that Walter is your grandfather. Is that correct to assume?
Walter is my grandfather, or was. I guess he still is, but uh, he was just an absolutely remarkable man, and so much of what I know about life, I learned from him by being with him every day.
Or, sorry, people still there?
I'm
Yeah.
still here.
Okay.
Did did I
Um,
get lost, or was it Alex?
I don't know. I guess we're having some internet issues.
Okay.
Uh, okay, Jack, are you still there?
Yeah,
Okay. All right, so Walter was your grandfather, and so this is more or less a family history then. Is that
It,
correct?
it is. And what happens is that you only get to things that are an actual part of our history or based on an actual part of our history about halfway through this book. There are going to be three books in this series according to the current plan. And books two and three are virtually all based on things that I have at least some firsthand knowledge of. Obviously, when your grandparents get married, you don't really know a whole lot about that.
so so this book takes part like post US Civil War. Can you kind of explain like the dynamics of the Oakley, your Oakley family moving to this part of the country and kind of what the environment was like?
Well, I'm going to give you an example of what the environment in the book is, and then tell you that my family never actually moved to New Mexico. These stories are based on things that happened mostly in Western Louisiana and East Texas. But because of the culture I grew up in, which was everything on television when I was young, uh, was a Western or a detective story or a comedy. So that's where my mind was when I knew my grandfather on a daily basis. He was never a cowboy. He was a construction man. He built lots of things in his life. And that's a whole lot of Walter Oakley's story in this book is building things for the Southern Pacific Railroad, which was the second transcontinental railroad in the country. But what caused the character Walter Oakley to move from Arkansas to New Mexico was to get away from the let's let's go back. What caused James Oakley, Walter's father, to move from Arkansas to New Mexico was getting over the trauma he experienced as a result of having been in the Civil War. So we're dealing with four generations up to me. My great grandfather, James Oakley, who's the first adult Oakley you meet, Walter Oakley, my grandfather, who is the next generation you meet, and then eventually we're going to deal with my father and his siblings, but we're not going to do that in this book.
So is your father is not introduced even at the end of the book? Is that correct?
Not not at the end of this book. He
Okay.
plays a huge role in the second book, but he doesn't appear except as a sick infant in this
Okay.
book, right at the end of it. So James Oakley is the first major character you're going to see. The second is Walter Oakley, who is 12 years old at the time we meet him. And his little brother, who would have been one of my great uncles, has been kidnapped off the porch of his home in New Mexico. So that's basically the setting of it. James Oakley is basically suffering from what we've known to call PTSD, based on his history in the Civil War. He needed to get away from that. And he went as far west as he figured he could go, which was New Mexico territory, a long time before New Mexico became a state. And he finds this beautiful spot, which is also fictional, in southwestern New Mexico, and builds his own farm. And he raises hogs for the United States Army, which patrolled the border, the Mexican border, and was headquartered in Fort Bliss, Texas, which was, you know, not right around the corner, but it was in the neighborhood of where this fictional farm was.
So is that like first, I guess, probably quarter of the book? Is that a true story where I
Not
guess
a
your
bit,
great
not
okay,
one lick. It's fiction.
okay.
Okay? And the first actual event that you're going to encounter in the book comes about halfway through, and it is Walter Oakley's wedding night. And that's a story my grandmother told me. When you get to that part, you're going to say, "Wow, that's kind of an incredible thing for a grandmother to tell a grandson." But she told it to me, and it's in the book.
Yeah.
What was
Okay, so
the go ahead.
no, you go, Jack.
I was gonna say what drew you to like cowboys and Indians? Like what was it just stuff
That's the way I
in
grew up.
Mhm.
Everything was cowboys and Indians or World War II when I was a kid, and that's pretty far fetched from today's culture. But that's that was popular country culture when I was a child. And if you were a hero, you were a cowboy.
I guess just to give so you would have grown up in the like the 60s or the 50s?
The late 40s and early 50s.
Late 40s, okay. So yeah, that would have been
I was born during World War II.
so that would have been around like the spaghetti westerns. Is that more or less where a lot of the inspiration comes from?
Actually, it, the most contemporary thing you can think of is Gunsmoke, and then at the movie theater, John Wayne was just getting started when I was in elementary school. He was just beginning to appear. So he became a huge star in the late 50s and through the 60s. But he wasn't the biggest cowboy star around when I was a kid. There were people like the Lone Ranger and Hopalong Cassidy. And uh, the Lone Ranger was actually based on some true stories. So, and the earliest Western culture that I encountered was on the radio, not on television, because we didn't have television until I was about in second or third grade.
So like I didn't have the chance to really look at some of your other novels, but like were your other stories westerns like this, or was this
No,
like
this is the
this is
only Western that I've ever written, and I think it's the only one I'll ever write, because the rest of the books in this series uh, move through the history of the family
time?
on up
Right.
into the Prohibition era, which this book gets into pretty extensively, and then the Great Depression, and then World War II, and then uh, actually into the 1950s when America was booming and my family was involved in the boom.
So I guess yeah, I mean you brought up the prohibition. The last I don't know like 50 pages of the book sort of touch on that. I guess are those it takes sort of a pretty dark turn. I guess are those accurate? Are those fictitious? Or are those real?
They're pretty accurate.
Pretty
It's
accurate.
that that's the whole problem with this family. Uh, we have the most remarkable generation that you can imagine. People who actually settled uh, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana. And then we have kids who come of age in the 1920s, and life got very, very wild and very strange. And I don't think my grandparents knew how to cope with that. You know, we've seen a lot of cultural generational issues very recently. And I think young parents today have a lot of trouble figuring out where their kids are coming from. I know it was very true when I came of age in the 60s. But it certainly happened in the 1920s, and it had some devastating impact on my family, not the least the two brothers, Ralph and Glenn, who were both engaged in bootlegging in a very severe way. And one of them got killed. One of them was actually murdered during this period of time. And my grandmother never got over that, never got over it.
Yeah, I would imagine that's very difficult to get over. I guess you bring up a good point. I feel like there's always some type of strife between, I guess generations, right? Like you always see that. I guess it's interesting that you see that going back really all the way, and nothing's really changed. I feel like parents haven't really figured out
That's right.
how to
You can read
bridge.
the Old Testament and you can see the same kind of stories from 6,000 years ago.
I mean,
So
I think
nothing
that
really changes, does it?
I think it's the quote from like Plato or Aristotle where he's talking about how like young people have it too easy now. I feel like maybe heard that phrase once or twice in my life. Uh,
Well, do you feel like you had it too easy?
no, of course not.
Growing up is hard, isn't it? It's a very difficult thing to do. And I can tell you from my point of view that growing old is hard too, because if there's anything just as challenging as adolescence, it is moving past your 65th birthday. You know, you're undergoing the same kinds of changes in reverse that you went through when you were a teenager, and it's a remarkable cycle. Doesn't mean your life is over. Doesn't mean that you can't do great things or enjoy life, but you have to learn how to do them differently. And this progression of life has a lot to do with all of this series of books, not just the first one, but all of it. And you start to see cycles repeat if you go far enough, don't you?
Yeah,
Like
true.
what would you say have been the biggest challenges for you as you've gotten older?
Um, Realizing that I have to move at a slower pace. You know, you take things like getting up and down from a chair for granted for all of your life once you learn how to walk. And then suddenly it becomes very difficult. Um, it's hot here today. I mean, the heat humidity index was up around to 108 degrees this afternoon. And I did a local television interview at the CBS station here in College Station. And it's only a mile. I can.
Sorry, Phil. I think we lost
Yeah, I
you
think I
there.
lost you. Here, we'll give him a second.
Okay, we're back. Do you want me to pick up where I was?
Yeah, you were
Yeah,
talking about the interview you just gave.
yeah, College
Yeah,
Station.
as I was saying, it was only a mile to this interview, and I'm real cheap. I mean, I'm way beyond frugal. So the notion that I would hire an Uber to walk a mile is foreign to me, but I'm glad I did because I would have been just absolutely wrung out with sweat by the time I got to the television station, and that wouldn't have worked out very well. But I had to argue with myself to go get to spend $7 for an Uber ride. That's just part of my nature. It's not that I'm poor; it's just that I'm cheap.
I can relate to that a little bit. So I guess going back, was part of the reason you wanted to write this just to, I guess, like get down some of like, you grow up hearing all these stories and you just kind of want to like highlight the stories and I guess maybe just write them down so other people would know them. Like,
No, I think I want people to know who Walter Oakley was. I think he was just really remarkable. And so was Ada, his wife. And and they profoundly impacted my life and they taught me lots of things that I think are worth passing on. But there was at the root of all of this, these two wonderful human beings who worked so hard and did so much to make a good life for themselves and for their children. And they had to sit through 30 or 40 years of continuous tragedy involving these magnificent children they had given life to. And I don't know how they did it. I've never been able to come to grips with how two great people could endure so much tragedy and not have it just completely wreck them. When you have children dying young, particularly when one dies violently and needlessly, and you have another one dying young, both of them alcohol related, and how do you get past that? You know, I don't know whether either one of you guys is a parent yet, but you just
it,
don't want
it,
anything to happen to your children, no matter what. You don't care what happens to you. You don't, I mean, you're not callous about it, but you really don't want something to happen to that child. And and they just had to sit there and watch it happen over and over again. And uh, that's 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 courage. That's character that's just worth preserving in my eyes.
so are the other two books out?
No, no. The second book will appear in January of next year, late January, perhaps February the 1st. The third book will appear in October of next year. So they're, you know, they're they're all finished except for the final edits, but they'll come out in that kind of sequence. And I decided when this book, the week this book was introduced, and I was back in College Station uh, to present the book at the Texas Historical Association annual meeting, and I decided then there was going to be a fourth book. Now it's not part of my writing contract, but I think they'll probably pick it up because I'm about a third of the way through it, and I think it could be the best of the books. But it wasn't something I ever envisioned. I I thought I had moved on, but it it just came up, and as it started to develop in my mind, it's just too good not to do.
And then I guess the fourth book will be a
That would be the fourth.
continuation. So
That would,
how much of yourself will the fourth book be about? Or 'cause I'm
the
assuming after four books, like I mean, you gotta get close to introducing
oh,
yourself.
we're going to be basically in pure fiction at that point.
Oh,
But
okay.
we're going to be in pure fiction based on the characters of two people who were developed in the first three books. Ralph Oakley, who was Walter's first child, uh, and one of the two bootlickers, and a woman named May, who was Brooks Oakley's high school sweetheart and appears very importantly in the third book. So these two characters are going to develop in contrast to one another. And some of it is based on some true things that Ralph Oakley did that were pretty unsavory later on in life after he got out after Prohibition ended. But uh, he's going to be contrasted with this much younger lady, and there's some other new characters that will be introduced during the course of this book who are vaguely based on real people, but uh, it is pure fiction. It's even though it'll be the fourth part of the series, it has very little to do with any event that ever actually happened.
Okay, so you go more towards a, I guess, just a fiction than more biographical as the books go
Yes,
on.
yes, and
All right.
they're all character studies. Remember, we're less documenting. We're less into documenting things that happened during these periods of time. Though for a lot of readers, a lot of it'll be new information because prohibition is not something that you study in American history for very long. It might take 2 days in a survey course in high school, something like that. It doesn't last very long. And and so while people who are much older have a lot of information about the 1930s and prohibition, uh, for people who are coming of age today, we might as well be talking about the Civil War. Their timeline is very different from what my parents' timeline was.
I mean, I feel like that's one of those interesting periods that, I mean, if I can think back to, I guess, high school history, I feel like it goes Civil War, then you more or less like kind of talk about Theodore or Roosevelt a little bit. And I think I don't even really know the Caribbean, right? And then you kind of skip
Yeah,
to World War One, the Great Depression, and then World War Two, and you kind of like
that's right.
gloss over, yeah.
You're just basically skimming these things,
Mhm.
and there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but uh, you've got you've got issues that continue throughout the history of this country. And I'm very much into history. I'm very much into it in terms of being a writer, and I'm also an educator who works, who works every day with high school kids, and and one of the things we have to continue to explain is background information that the older people in the environment where I work have a passing acquaintance with, but the people who are actually in high school don't really know what you're talking about. It, if there's one thing that your typical high school student knows about John Kennedy, other than the fact that he was assassinated, is that he was somehow involved with Marilyn Monroe. You know, now there, there was more to the new frontier. There was more to the conflict in Berlin. There was more than the Cuban Missile Crisis in John Kennedy's life. But he basically gets credit for two things: getting killed and having some kind of mysterious involvement with Marilyn Monroe. And that's what the kids pick up on. And it's perfectly natural, but uh, we're still recovering from the First World War in terms of the way the leadership of the world is progressing today. They've gone back to repeating mistakes of previous generations, and and it's very difficult to capsulize all this in history. We're we just did a shot, and the mission is going on right now, where we have astronauts at the space station basically repeating stuff that the United States learned how to do in the 1960s, but hasn't done since the 1970s. Once the space shuttle came into being, we forgot about all the things that went into the Mercury and Apollo programs. Uh, but that was real science. You know, these guys went to the moon. Now, You don't remember a time
Allegedly.
when people just dreamed about going to the moon. But these guys did it, and it was so far back that it's it's kind of routine, but you've never seen it done.
Mhm.
Sorry, you touched on how you touched on the leadership recovering from, I guess, the First World War. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that? Or
The
like what mistakes are we still making that they, I guess, did in World War One?
well, World War One wound up with a couple of British think tankers drawing maps all over the world. And nowhere did they do a worse job than in the Middle East. And we have been paying for that ever since. And we're still dealing with the same kinds of dispute in modern day Israel and Gaza and Lebanon and parts of Syria and parts of Iraq and Afghanistan that came out of all that mess that didn't get settled after World War One, when the British Empire began to come apart. So those mistakes are still very much the problem of President Biden and President Trump. They've had to deal with that stuff to this very day. We're dealing with a crisis right now in our country where what one generation thinks is totally a sanctified part of our history, to see that no people ever suffer the way the Jews of World War II did again. And young people who don't really have the same background in the Holocaust, it's not that they don't necessarily believe it, but it doesn't have any poignant memories to them the way it does for President Biden. But they can see what American weaponry and the Israeli armed forces have done in Gaza, which is turn it into rubble. And so you've got, in a generational sense, when people say, well, what about the Palestinians? And it gets really muddy. You know, how can you say, well, this is right, and that that happened before is so long ago that we should forget? No, remember the phrase that's always key in Israeli history is never forget. Never forget, because it will happen again. But that's a hard lesson when you don't really have any contact with the Holocaust, but you can see with your own eyes what's happening to the descendants of the Palestinians. It's a dispute that's unresolved, and it's been unresolved for a long time in history, but it really got messed up in World War One. Is that an answer to your question?
Oh yeah, yeah, very much so.
I think it touches on like this idea that there's just these points in history that that really have that really shape the world. And I mean, you mentioned prohibition might only get mentioned in a couple paragraphs in a history book or a couple pages. And I kind of wonder, like in 100 years, I mean, will COVID be one of those types of events where, for us, it really impacts a lot of how we work and live and where we live. And some people might not really appreciate it, in the future.
That's right, because when I was coming of age in Austin and in the 1960s and 50s, they were still talking about the Spanish flu of
Sure.
1919, and World War One didn't kill. And this is a hard thing to say. It didn't kill as many Americans as American soldiers died from that flu pandemic. They were literally taking American soldiers, some of whom had never even gotten to Europe, who died of the flu at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, back home for burial in freight cars. That's how many of them died. And this was right at the tail end of World War I, but nobody even remembered that thing until we got into COVID.
Yeah.
And
Isn't that more or less what ended World War One, though?
well, it played a big role. I mean, you know, the Russians, by the time the communist revolution occurred, the Russians were sending 12-year-old kids who didn't even have rifles into battle. And so the number of Russian soldiers and civilians who died as a result of World War I was phenomenal. But the flu was killing everybody. Turks, Russians, Americans, French, British. It was killing everybody in the world, just like COVID did. And the only difference was it didn't travel quite as fast because we didn't have international air travel. But you may be right. 100 years from now, we may have had 17 pandemics by then. And I hope not. But there's no reason why we couldn't. You know, I mean, we don't really we don't really know what we did right during COVID that finally killed it off. We know what we tried, but we haven't had enough time to study it to figure out what worked and what didn't. So yeah, it could wind up being that way. But we've we we forget the lessons of the past too quickly. And we're fighting a major war in Europe right now, again. And you can find several periods of 200 years at a stretch where Europe was at war. And we have gotten so used to Europe being a prosperous and peaceful country, continent that we forget its history. And its history is very bloody.
You mean modern Americans forget its history, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, go ahead.
I was just going to add, so my wife is Austrian, and it's funny you mentioned that because when I'm talking to her friends in Austria, it's almost like they don't know some of the history, and because a lot of the gun
They weren't taught.
control, they just don't know like how bad it was, and they just don't think it could happen again. It just,
But it is happening again.
yeah.
It is happening again. It's this time it's not German induced. It's it's Vladimir Putin, but it's it's the same concept. It's one leader, one supreme leader who has managed to get himself into a position of being unchecked by any other force within his own country. And he is free to kill as many Russian kids as he wants to and as many Ukrainian kids as he can.
Yeah. I guess it's an interesting time. I guess every time's interesting, but it seems like it's an interesting time in which we live in.
And that's another reason that in my family, I kind of thought that I had missed a lot of interesting times because, as you'll see in the second book, my father wanted to see the impact of the Great Depression firsthand, and he did some pretty outrageous things to get to do that. I'm not going to spoil the book by telling you everything that's in it, but I look back on World War One, World War Two, the Great Depression, and said, "Man, I missed all of that. That was, that must have been some time to be part of." Well, I didn't miss the civil rights movement. I was right smack in the middle of it, and I covered civil rights activities as a journalist for better than 20 years. You know, it it was major history, but all that too has faded. And the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of 1965 and 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Time has changed, the courts have changed, and a lot of the things that were supposed to be concrete uh, have been powdered down. You know, it's we've moved on, and the problem wasn't solved when we moved on. We have, as not just our country, but I think it's human nature to get tired of doing something and go do something else for a while. But you don't remember that you didn't fix all the problems. You just left some of them behind. There was a saying during Vietnam, well, we should just declare victory and leave. Well, we weren't winning, but it would have been fine to say we were and leave. But we had that debate for about 3 more years before we finally left. And of course, the place collapsed right after we left. Collapsed right after we left. What happened in Afghanistan? The last plane went off the
Collapse.
runway before it collapsed, and it reverted back with a little bit of technology being the difference. It reverted back to what it was 2,000 years ago, which was absolute chaos right in the middle of some of the biggest travel routes in the world. Afghanistan has got a history that just goes on forever, and nobody's ever conquered it. People just keep passing through and think they've done something that they really haven't done. But everybody who comes through gets involved in a quagmire, and that goes back at least to Roman times.
Okay, I think this is just sort of a general question, but you said you're an educator. Are you a history teacher?
No, but I work with a lot of history students. I work with special education kids who are what we used to call mainstreamed into regular classrooms. So, and most of the classrooms I sit in are history classes, and of course, most of the kids in most of those classes are not special ed kids. So I get a good lesson from all of them about what they know and what they don't know, and they know all kinds of things. If you don't work with kids every day, you don't have any concept of how smart they are. But uh, they didn't learn the same things I learned, and they didn't learn the same things you learned, you know. And I can remember, I think I went to a pretty severe high school from an academic standpoint, but uh, I can remember people saying, these kids have it easy. They're not, they're, it's not rigorous and they're not learning anything. Well, we learned a lot, you know. It, it was, it was a time of phenomenal change in technology, but nothing like what we're seeing right now. You know, the things that were involved in the space program that we saw come to fruition were beyond imagination at the time they happened. But they're old news now, and what's happening on a daily basis right now in this world is just mind-boggling. The progression of human knowledge uh, far exceeds our ability to learn how to use the newfound knowledge well.
I think that's very true.
Does the technology make you optimistic or pessimistic?
It makes me optimistic.
Okay.
You know, we're having a big debate right now on education, and it's bled into the mainstream of politics about cell phones in the classroom. Uh, there's only one way to do this, and that's to take those cell phones away from the kids when they walk in the building and let them pick them up on their way out. You can't control them so long as they're floating around the building. And I can just tell you that from everyday experience. And we've tried everything in the world. It's just not, it's putting toothpaste back into the tube. It's just not going to work. But it's a big political issue at this point. It may be for a few years or a few weeks, but cell phones aren't going away. They just get better all the time. And you can say, well, kids will never learn how to write so long as they let Chat GPT write their papers for them. Well, it's not going away. So we better learn how to use it productively. We need to quit treating it like something that we can control or fix, because we can't control it or fix it. We might be smart enough to direct it in a positive way, but we're not going to be able to make it just disappear. It won't disappear.
Do you have a solution to how ChatGPT should be used? I guess, or if at all.
Well, it should be used as a base to start from, not as a finished paper. That you, if you can write a paper beginning with that version and go learn something and add what you learned on to what was already sitting out there in the databases, then I think that's valuable education. But you need to be able to show that you've put something original into it. Is it going to teach you how to punctuate a sentence? No, but maybe you don't need that much instruction anymore on how to punctuate sentences. Apparently, the math teachers are having a lot of problems teaching higher concepts of math because so many kids haven't learned multiplication tables. And so the way they do math requires you to be able to call from your own memory in rapid sequence arithmetic computations, like 3 times 2 is 6. A lot of kids don't know that by memory. They have to use their calculator to find out what 3 times 2 is, and that's not their fault. But somehow or another, you've got to learn how to meet kids where they are and work up from that. You can't say, well, we're just going to wipe all this stuff out and everybody's going to go back with pencils and paper and show us how they set up an equation and solve a problem with that equation. We've passed that. So learn how to use the tools productively. And ChatGPT is just the beginning of this whole business. It's going to blossom, isn't it? It's going to really grow fast. And my son, my older son, who writes a whole lot of code, is a part of his profession, says it helps me enormously because it can do the repetitive stuff a lot faster than I can. And it gives me time to make the app or the application that he's fixing for somebody come together much faster. And I think that's productive use of artificial intelligence. And we have to learn how to use that in our education system as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've seen some funny instances of ChatGPT pumping out some very, I guess, interesting things. Yeah, just Jack, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I think you've got to go back and fact check what it tells you.
Of course, yeah.
If you just accept what it says is true, you run a big risk of being wrong. But it works so fast. You can literally say, write me 500 words about the Spanish Civil War. And it comes up with 500 words, but it may have some basic facts wrong because they were wrong in the database, because it doesn't know what's right or wrong, and it has limitations on how much it's going to look back and put together for you. So you might want to read something else, just just to make sure that this guy wasn't already dead before the subject that you asked for was written, because unless whatever it chose to sample told it that, it doesn't know.
Yeah, I think the danger is, what information's going in, because there's that famous saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage out. That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely true. And that's one of you guys is a business guru, as I understand it, and the other is a chemist. Is that right?
Yeah,
I don't know
Jackson's a
if I would
business.
call myself a business guru, but I was an actuary for a while, and now I do more real estate type things.
I'm still a chemist, so.
I know we wandered around, but I think you guys like to do that, and I certainly I enjoy talking about education, because even though I've only been at it for 2 years now, these kids have meant so much to my life. They've given me so much more than I could have ever dreamed of giving to them. They're magnificent creatures. They're just absolutely, completely beautiful until they're horrid.
I mean, I don't want to end on a negative note, but like, so you've mentioned some things that like make you optimistic, but like, and I know we mentioned some of the historical items, but like from this younger generation and our current American culture, what kind of worries you projecting forward?
I I want to go back a little bit to answer that question. Uh, I remember in the 70s, when I was spending a lot of time covering school busing cases, I had a superintendent of education from Shreveport on an interview program I was doing. And I said to him, and it's basically the same question you're answering me, with all that's going on, with all of the white flight from public education, how can we be optimistic about the future of education, and specifically public education in our country? And this was about 3 years after Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And I was pretty young, but he called me Mr. Oakley, and he said, Mr. Oakley,
I think we lost him again.
I think we lost Phil again. Yeah.
Darn it.
you want me to pick that up again from where we were?
Yeah. From like when you said the guy was calling you Mr. Oakley.
Mr. Oakley.
Yeah. He said, Mr. Oakley, every one of these kids who was on that mission was educated in public schools, and public universities. And we just put a man on the moon. For thousands of years, people have been dreaming about doing something like that. And American kids with public educations did that. Well, if those kids, those young men, and they were all men in those days, except some of the ladies in the control room at NASA. But if those people could do that, imagine what our kids, with the technological tools they have to work with, are going to be able to do in this generation that's coming right now. We're just getting started. We're just getting started. We didn't blow up the world after World War II, and maybe we can go another 100 years without destroying it altogether. And if we can do that, then there is no end to how much more advanced we can become in the next 100 years. And we'll do it in this country, at least, mostly through public schools.
All right. Well, I feel like that's a pretty optimistic,
Is that optimistic?
forward-looking. Yeah, I was gonna say that's a pretty heartwarming, forward-looking sentiment there. Uh,
I'm very optimistic, and we hear about all the horrible things that some of these kids do, and we hear about shootings, and they're very real, and they scare us all to death. And they've happened at schools not 2 miles from where I work every day. But that's not all there is going on in those schools. We all have to grow up. We all have to go through all of this hormonal business and uh, rediscovery of the wheel every time. But it advances. Civilization does advance. It's not just the destructive things, but the positive things. Uh, my grandfather didn't live as old as I am right now. And uh, I've had doctors tell me I would easily live from a statistical standpoint until I'm 90. Well, it sounds pretty good to me, so long as I'm healthy enough to know that I'm I'm still alive, and that I'm able to read and have good discussions with people, and enjoy all manner of things. There's so much to enjoy. There's so much to experience, and uh, so long as you can be doing those things, it's indescribably good.
I think that might be our good note to
yeah,
end on.
I think that's a good.
I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
think that's a good
I
note
don't
to
think
end
we're
on.
getting better than that.
Well,
Guys, this has been amazing. From listening to your other your shows, I know y'all like to wander around a bit, and like I said, you're really smart. I had to run to keep up with you.
Phil, I appreciate you saying that. Yes,
Yeah, we do. Yeah, appreciate that,
we
and
we
we definitely like to move around a little.
we def yeah.
That's all right. There's a space to do that. The technology is existing, and it's fun. And
I guess to bring it back a little bit, the book was Little Hatchet. Yeah, it was a very good and enjoyable read. Good job, Phil.
well, hold on. I think I've got one here that I can. Well, these are all bundled up, but I'll break into this thing and pull one out and hold it up.
Cool.
I guess if Phil, if you want to give people, just want to plug yourself where people can find you or where they can find your book. Uh,
Sure, you can find Little Hatchet at all the major booksellers: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Apple. Uh, they're in. They're not sitting on displays in all of the big bookstores, but they're if they don't have them in stock, you can get them within a day at any major bookseller. And the distribution is being handled by Texas A&M University Press. And my publisher is a brilliant young man from Wimberley, Texas, which is part of suburban Austin. And we're not the biggest people in the publication business, but we do some good work. And I'm not the oldest guy doing this. There's one fella who is 92, and a lady who writes romance novels who's in her 80s. So uh, we're we're an interesting crew anyway.
okay, well, Phil, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. It was great, I guess, meeting you and just I don't know. I feel like you went on a journey where we just meandered around a lot as well. It was fun having you on.
It was fun. And I hope you'll let me come back when we get books 2 and 3 out.
Yeah,
For sure.
I look forward to it. You said book two comes out in, was it January of 2025?
That's correct.
All right. Well, I
And
think we
there are going to be two
will,
books. There are going to be 2 books in 2025.
okay.
So we'll have a full measure.
Okay. Well, I
Fantastic.
guess with that said, Jack, do you want to take us out?
Sure. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. For the original episodes, the OGs, please visit brothersonbooks.com. I am Jack Allweil. With me, as always, is my brother Alex Allweil. And today we had special guest Phil Oakley. So until next time.